are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010 we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for the opportunity to come before you. Lord, we ask that you bless these people on the call. We ask that you bless Dan and the work that he's doing to expose the truth in this country. Guide us, Lord, in all that we do, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Mr. Happel, I yield the floor to you.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening for Part 2 of our Border Security and Illegal Immigration program. It's a special program. Is it really a matter of national security? And I believe it is. And our guests tonight, Mr. Chuck Floyd and Bruce Moran, are both national security experts, and they've been working on the border security program for the Trump administration. And as our listeners would probably remember from last week, this will be a continuation of last week's show. We got into exactly what the border security issues were and what we needed to do to secure our borders and why it's important for the national sovereignty of our country, because without secure borders, we have really no law and order on our borders. And frankly, we're losing our country through all these open border policies. And Chuck, I guess I will lead into this, thanking you for being our guest again this week, and this will probably allow us to have enough time to really go over all the issues, because last week there's so many things to talk about that we couldn't do it in 1 hour. And I thank you for coming back, and I guess what I'd ask if you would very quickly just kind of recap some of the things that you talked about last week, and then we'll start from there.
Okay, good. It's certainly a pleasure to be back to talk to your many listeners about the border security plan that President Trump wants to do and the status of it. Last week we talked about how a border security plan can be effective. Well, you have to have a layered security plan, just like the military, where, one item will not stop the intruder. You have to have a layered security plan, and so you need a physical barrier along with a road for access so that the CBP can have a quick reaction teams to get out and arrest and detain people that get across the first fence. And then you have a second fence, and you have the seismic sensors to denote people that are touching the fence. So we have a smart fence on the front side of the Mexican side and a dumb fence on the back side. But we do have cameras and sensors and other things on the other side of the dumb fence so that we can make sure that we track everything. So, the OMB director has said that they're looking at spending up to $5, $6, $7 million a mile on this thing. We think it can be done for no more than $3 million a mile, and if they really wanted to use military tactics, they could do it for $1 million a mile. However, that's not going to happen. So anyhow, we can talk today about what has to happen with CBP, and then how ICE and Congress and everybody else has a big play in this thing, because you have a lot of people inside DHS, career federal workers, who really don't want this, and you have a lot of members of Congress who don't want this, and you have a lot of members in districts along the border who don't want this security plan. So what the President has to do, and DHS Secretary Kelly, what they have to do is come up with a model of a fiscal barrier, then all the sensors, the cameras, and everything else they need, and then they need to build this model across the entire 2,000 miles. And so, again, what we suggested to them is that they break it down into 50-mile increments, have a different contractor per 50 miles. That way you got 40 contractors starting at the same time all along the border, and within 2 years this thing can be finished. And if you do the same model across the entire 2,000 miles, you know the scope, you know the schedule, and you know the budget. And so this is the best way to do it. President Trump does this kind of thing with all of his buildings, his golf courses, and he's a contractor. He knows how to construct things. And so, scope, schedule, budget would be very important, but the replication across the entire border of the same security layered system has to happen.
Okay, good. That's a great lead-in. And incidentally, I want to point out to our listeners that if we dissolve all our national borders and allow unlimited immigration by third world countries, as some people are proposing, it really is a program that is modeled on UN Agenda 21 and on the United Nations global governance model, which will eliminate all national borders and will basically create an end to national sovereignty through the elimination of those borders. And that would create a world hegemony under a Marxist socialist rabble of regionally appointed governments, and they're appointed, not elected, regionally appointed governments by the UN and controlled by the UN. And if we're willing to accept the political and social dictates of an international group that is primarily socialist and communist and tin pot dictators in makeup, we are really in for a problem. And I think a lot of the people that so-called social liberals that are concerned that we need to open our borders to everyone, irregardless of their political leanings, their willingness to adapt to our laws or to our social norms, that all sounds just warm and fuzzy and nice on paper, but if you want to destroy a culture, that's the best way to do it. And frankly, we're seeing that now in Europe, in France, in Germany, in Belgium, throughout Europe. And we cannot afford to do that unless we want to lose our national sovereignty. So anyway, I didn't mean to get off on a tangent, but that gives a pretty good lead-in, too, for why socially we cannot afford to leave these borders open and completely unrestricted. Bruce, are you on with the call?
Yes, sir. I've been listening, and what Chuck is saying is we're going to have a fully integrated border security system with the highest technology available. It'll protect everybody also. And what does that mean? Well, it protects both sides of the border, and it helps people come through legally. Right now, we don't have an enforcement program that makes sure that everybody isn't harmed on the way through. Mexico is a portal for a lot of illegal trafficking of people, kids, and drugs. And once you start put up a legitimate border, these access points are all cut off. As Chuck was saying, there's a seismographic part of the border which is quite unique. And it actually, you can't dig and you can't over. In other words, it'll tell you if there's a child walking or an adult walking versus an animal, and it'll help you differentiate how fast they're going and where they're coming. So border security with drones can actually eliminate a lot of the risk involved for the people. People come through normally through the gates, and they'll get their visas and have a place to go. The current system is broke. I mean, broken to the far extent that it's illegal in terms of people are being abused and raped at the borders of women. As we know from Central America, there are like 80% of the women being raped coming across. I mean, this is unacceptable. And the children, like we were talking about, being sold as sex slaves, and then you get that whole pedophile group, that supports this, and that has to stop. We're talking about a humanitarian effort here that's not been addressed. And what Chuck has been working on, and I have been working on since 2005, 2006, to make sure that all people are taken care of as legal migrants, and help them understand the importance of respect for the countries and what you're going to have here when you get here.
Well, that's a really good way to put this whole thing, because in reality, I don't think anybody in this country is against all immigration. We're against the illegal aspects of the immigration, and we're against it because there's no way of controlling who and what you're allowing to come into the country. And between the mules that are and the coyotes that are bringing drugs and illegal persons and contraband and all the other illegal things into the country, without any control along those borders, we're just begging to have a problem.
Yeah, Chuck and I have been working on this. Like I said, it's like 11 years, and it came into effect with Senator Frisk with the Secure America's Borders Act. But Chuck and I also work overseas, and we're also helping understand the safety zones that are needed over there in Iraq and Syria, and a type of genocide going on over there with the Christians. And it's the same situation. To me, it's unbelievable that if we're looking at what's going on overseas, we have the same situation happen here in America at the borders. That's unacceptable in any quarter.
Hey, Dan, this is Chuck. You had a very key point a while ago that you talked to your listeners about on culture. The progressive and the left have been trying to disintegrate our culture, our Christian religion, our standards, our holidays such as Christmas, so that they can wipe all this out, so that we think that our kids and others that are growing up think that, hey, we have to be monolithic and we can't have our own background, religion, and holidays and whatever, and we have to be inclusive of everybody in the world. Well, that's not true, and that doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. If you go to Saudi Arabia, you can't even take your Bible into the country. And so there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes that try to destroy our culture every day. And one of the key things that we've seen with all the illegals coming across the border, you look at the Goldwater Range and how beautiful that is with the cactus and everything down there, and we have an environmental catastrophe on our southern border by all these coyotes, all these people coming across, trash and vehicles all over the range. Our national areas are being destroyed, and nobody on the left and progressive, they're not saying anything about this. And then you have, if you look at the Heritage Foundation, every year they'll come out with an analysis of what countries are doing around the world, and they look at human trafficking. The human trafficking in the United States has gone up over the last 20 years due to the illegals coming into the country, where they bring drugs. You look at the number of drugs that are happening all over, even in small town USA, all over. The opioids and the drugs are just destroying our youth and our young adults. And so by having a fiscal barrier stopping the drug cartels of bringing these drugs in and billions of dollars going out, we're going to help the average citizen, we're going to help them with new jobs, and we're going to help them with their families, and we have to get back to our culture.
Well, you're absolutely right, and one of the things that needs to be pointed out is that this is a humanitarian thing for the people that are coming into our country, because so many of them are being abused, and we have a return to slavery and the pedophiles and the sex trafficking and all that, a return to slavery that we haven't seen in 150 years. And I think, I know that the progressives don't want to talk about that, but the fact is with the open border plan that we have right now, we're returning to an awful lot of social ills that need to be stopped. And, what you're talking about is something that needs to happen. We didn't have those same kinds of problems 50 years ago. And now we do because of this open border policy. So thank you guys for doing this. And I need to mention to our listeners that you just finished a border plan for the Trump administration. I believe you just finished it up last night. Is that correct?
We finished it up. However, the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, they are going to issue an RFP, request for proposals. It's supposed to be out this week. It hasn't come out yet, on the border structure, wall structure, fence structure, and then they're going to pick what they want. And so I'm not quite sure whether DHS and CBP are doing the correct contract strategy on the entire border solution at this point in time. I haven't seen everything that they're doing, but I just don't think that they have the right contract strategy this time. And somebody from my side needs to get in there to help Secretary Kelly and President Trump make sure this thing is done correctly. If not, it's going to be a failure, just like under President Bush with SBI.
Well, that would be a shame. I would like to address, I know that part of your plan was dividing the southern border into 12 sectors, and I know there's a reason for that. Can you gentlemen tell me what that, or what our listeners, what that rationale is, and why the 12 border sectors are important?
Okay. The CBP actually divided the entire border into 12 sectors years ago. And so, they divided it into the 12 sectors from Texas all the way to California. That way they can assign certain CBP agents in different sectors, and then they also can get the statistics as far as who's coming across in each sector, what's happening in each sector, how many kids are coming across, how many drugs, and all the other sort of things. And again, CBP has not come forth with that information to the American public, and so they keep that under wraps. But they're the ones that put it in 12 different sectors. The plan to build a wall would be construction contractors doing 50-mile increments. But the 12 sectors are fine, because that way in those 12 sectors you can have illegals and processing centers, detention centers, and the housing of CBP agents and those sort of things in those 12 sectors, so that you have the CONOPS control of the operation across the border in the different sectors, and it's easier to manage the different sectors. And so you put certain commanders in, and then they will come up to the state level and to the federal level as far as what they're doing, and have accountability.
So what Chuck is saying, it's a fully integrated system, but they're broken up into sectors so you can manage them and have metrics. Metrics are measures to find out what's actually happening in that particular sector. Then if you need to bolster it with something else, you'll be able to immediately address the issue, because this can be a 24/7 real-time system. What we have right now is nothing even compared to what Chuck has been talking about in terms of the capabilities of what the border security system can do. So what we're trying to convey here is that it doesn't matter if it's a sector, it's a matter of the integration and how the different groups of enforcement is done at each of these points. And that's the critical part of it. And we can go on to another area. So, unless you want to talk about
one of the things that I remember in the discussion that I had with you, Chuck, is that the reason I guess that some sectors are more problematic than others, and that some of the sectors are maybe have even two command vehicle or two command centers in each sector. What are the really troubling areas of the border that you see at this point?
There are 5 key smuggling areas across the southern border, and CBP, DHS, they all know where they are. The big problem, you have one in Texas. The big problem is in Arizona and Tucson sector. They know exactly where the drugs are coming across, where the safe houses are located, and everything else. And Secretary Kelly has to get control of this and have CBP work with ICE, and ICE go in and raid these safe houses and all these other, the day labor centers and all these other places that harbor, these illegals and these fugitives. So, we know exactly, where the illegals are coming across, where the drugs coming across, and CBP must target those 5 areas first. They have to start building there and then work out. And so, all that's been identified, and, they know where they have to secure the border first.
What Chuck is also saying is, they're going to secure the border, but you're identifying the key strategic points, and it happens to be drugs at this point. There's safe houses he's talking about, but there's also the aiding and abetting, and that goes all the way through the sanctuary cities and all throughout the United States. So once you stop it at the border and near the border, and with the safe houses around the border, then it starts pulling back across the United States. So it puts a stranglehold on the amount of drugs coming through and the amount of people that can aid and abet, because now they're under the gun and people know who they are, where they're at, and how they're going to get to them.
Right. Well, one of the other problems, and I'm sure you folks have identified that, but are employers that are willingly employing illegals and taking advantage of the cheap labor that they can get to kind of circumvent the system.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. So what we've written in the total immigration plan, again, the border security plan is just one leg of the entire comprehensive immigration policy that has to happen, and Congress has to pass that legislation. And so they need to enforce E-Verify, make it mandatory, and then if an employer hires an illegal knowingly and doesn't have and does not have the proper documentation, then that employer can be fined and go to jail. The other thing that this legislation must have is that when these elected politicians, such as the mayor of New York or governor of California, these different areas that have sanctuary cities, the legislation should say, if you as a politician do not uphold your constitutional duty to enforce the law, then Department of Justice can come in and arrest you, and you can also be liable in civil court in case of a person is hurt or killed by an illegal. So this legislation has to be done by Congress, and do they have the backbone to do it? I doubt it, but they should.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to have you really talk to our listeners about is, first of all, the Obama administration and their total disregard for secure borders, or maybe I'm wrong on that. I'll let you guys answer that one. But also maybe lead into your experience with the fledgling Trump administration, and how serious they are about upholding the border security. So let's start with the Obama administration. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of your experiences in dealing with the national security stuff at the highest levels in Congress and so forth, and how the Obama administration handled border security?
I think we're talking about enforcement and catch and release. Those would be probably the two striking differences in what we're going to do. As you saw, the border security agents endorsed Trump. There's a reason for that. It's because they're not being able to do their job on the borders. And that's the bottom line. And the second part is what Chuck and I have been working on, and a lot of people have understood to be a clear and distinct form of making a wall, making barriers to protect everybody correctly. And we're talking about there's a lot of abuse going on once they get over here, too, because they don't know the laws. So when people come over here, they're giving outright rule to do anything they want in the United States. So what we're looking at is a third of our prisons are filled with illegal aliens. Yeah, and that's a problem. And that's the first thing President Trump is doing right now as we're speaking. He's carrying forth on his word to the American people. He is getting the people that are not supposed to be here out of here, those that are felons out of here.
Let's talk about the Obama administration, what they didn't do, and why didn't they do that? Well, if you go beneath the skirt and really take a look at what's going on, the Democrats and the left and the progressives, they're doing this for one reason only, for political purposes. They want new voters, and they also want to keep this issue up front with no solution. They had plenty of chance when they had complete control of the White House and Congress to do something, and they punted. That's because they don't want to have a solution. I mean, I was talking with Bruce yesterday about this, and this is just the same way as with the Palestinians. All the Arab countries do not want a solution. They want to keep this issue going and going and going because it benefits them monetarily. And so, same way with the Democrats on this, they're not concerned about the lives of American citizens, about jobs being taken away from American citizens. They're concerned about new voters and staying in power and getting reelected. That's all they're concerned about. That's what Obama and all his team were concerned about. And he did not enforce hardly any of the laws on the books, and he created more problems because he put out information. Hey, kids come across the border. Mothers come across the border, and so you had thousands and thousands of kids and mothers and with their children come up, from Central South America, and as soon as they didn't run from CBP agents, they turned themselves in. They said, "I'm here, take care of me." And guess what Obama did? He gave them a plane ticket to anywhere in the U.S. they wanted to go. If they had relatives in Salt Lake City or Washington, D.C. or whatever, CBP spent our tax money and gave them a plane ticket to wherever they wanted to go and said, "See you in court in 6 months." Well, guess what? They never show up.
Well, that's another thing I think that people don't realize is that there are a lot of medical issues and a lot of diseases, and some of them, almost incurable diseases that are coming across the border, and there's no way that they've been properly vetted in that regard. Am I right on that too?
Yeah, you're right. When all those kids started coming across the border 3 years ago, even up to 4 years ago, you saw a dramatic increase of diseases that we had just wiped out across the American countryside. No schools had it, and all of a sudden it would show up in all the different states all across the United States. The reason why is that Obama allowed all these illegals to come in. They were not checked. They had all kinds of different diseases and whooping cough and everything else. and then he shipped them all to the United States so that they weren't in one area. And all the school systems, all the health facilities had to deal with it. Every year, the American public, they laughed and what I wrote, well, how much is this wall going to cost? We spend $100 billion a year taking care of all the illegals, which is about 20 million right now, in prisons, in schools, in healthcare, and everything else. So even if you spend $20 billion for the wall, you're saving tremendous amounts of money. And then, what do we do with, how do we pay for the wall? Again, we'll get into that shortly, when we talk about the finances of the wall and how the American citizens are going to pay for it up front, but Mexico and others are going to pay for it in the long run.
Okay, well, that's actually a good segue into that discussion. Let's talk about how the wall is going to be paid for. Give us some kind of an idea of what the proposals are and how the United States can anticipate that this wall will be paid for, and also create an actual fiscal surplus as far as the country is concerned once it's constructed.
Okay, Bruce, you want to go first, and I'll chime in.
Okay. You're going to see a savings of anywhere of $50 billion to $90 billion a year. We're just not going to be housing felons in our prison. That's a lot of dough. And you have that money saved that will that more than enough pays for the border. That's one. Now you got the hospital care we were just talking about. And I believe we lost 120 hospitals. There were some reports that said more, some said less, on the border areas because people are coming across and using the facilities right away. And then they walk away not paying the bills. So like Chuck was saying and you were saying, if people are checked before they come across for whooping cough or polio, I think polio was another one that we saw a rise on. Those are major things that happen in our schools, and the kids don't know what's going on, and the parents have to deal with it. So just the cost of the social cost, the medical cost, and the entire cost, you're talking about, I would say you're getting into what I've already talked about. In a year, that's over $100 billion.
Yeah. So let's talk about how will the American taxpayer, pay for it and then benefit them. We will pay for it up front with legislation, and we will pay for it up front. However, how can we avoid the total cost and get reimbursed for building the wall? One is that you tax legal people coming into work every day in the U.S. And so right now along the southern border, there are hundreds of, it's 100,000 immigrants that come across the border every day to go to work, and then they go back home. So you can tax them. You tax the goods that are coming into the U.S. You look at the amount of goods that are being made in Mexico that are coming to the U.S. tax-free. The other is you look at it's about $30 billion a year in remittances that the illegal immigration population make and send back to Mexico and Central and South American countries every year. So you can tax that. An example of that is, the Western Union. Another example is Bank of America. And then Walmart and other international companies like Walmart, they have a program inside of Walmart where if you are in Phoenix, you can go to the Walmart bank, put in $500, and guess what? Your family in Mexico City can use that $500 to buy Walmart products at Walmart. And so you never even see a transaction like Western Union or Bank of America. It's all internal to Walmart. And so there are many, many ways that we're going to get our $20 billion back by building the wall. And again, we will save, $80 million a year right now just in not having any more resources going toward education and prisons and healthcare. And you look at the amount of illegal aliens that have kids that are now U.S. citizens, and they're on welfare. And so there's lots of money involved in this thing and lots of ways to go after, making others pay for the wall.
Okay, well, that's a good explanation. And incidentally, I want to remind our listeners that this is billions, not millions, billions, and there are some really huge numbers.
Yeah, hundreds of billions.
Hundreds of billions.
It's mind-boggling when you really put your head to the stone and start looking at, oh my God, all these different costs that are affected by having the illegal immigration happening at the borders, the cost to us socially. And I don't mean social costs in terms of, it happens in the family. I'm talking about dollar costs, because your education goes up, your insurance costs go up, everything across the board goes up. The food stamps, all these different areas that people are getting and taking advantage of our system will come to a halt in certain areas. Not complete halts, because there's always be people, getting over on the system, but you'll be seeing a larger impact for people in the United States to get what they deserve coming to them. We didn't even talk about that. What happens to the senior citizens, the kids in inner cities, when all this money starts to flow back in after the border is fully constructed and all the drug trafficking is coming to halt in certain areas, or put, contained, then you have a different American culture. It comes back to where we were, like you were saying, in the 50s and the 60s. And it has a different, tone to it, because now you're safer, you're more secure. Exactly what President Trump was talking about. We're safer, more secure, we're following the rule of law, and we're understanding that you need to respect for the country and respect for each citizen, and we're going to respect each other just that much more.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, there's a government report that says that 1/4 of all welfare payments go to individuals. I'm not saying citizens, I'm saying individuals in the state of California. And guess which state has the most illegals?
Yep, you're
California.
Right on the money there. And I have a sister-in-law who is a hospital administrator. She's retired now, but she was talking about how many of the hospitals in California are being forced to close down just because of the overuse by illegals of the medical system there, and primarily emergency room, because they can go to an emergency room and they can't refuse service to them. So
that's right.
That's a real problem, and you alluded to it earlier, and I really appreciate your comments on that. We need to take a very short break, but we will be right back with the program, and we'll continue this discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want to thank you for coming to this show week in and week out. We encourage you to go to republicfortheunitedstates.org and look at the wide array of shows that we've held on this network for the last 7 years. We encourage you to come to the Wednesday night Building the State phone call. You can get the information at republicfortheunitedstates.org. Again, Mr. Happel, I yield the floor.
Okay, we're back, and I want to ask Chuck and Bruce. I know we've had these conversations a little bit kind of off the broadcast, but can you kind of explain how the whole North American Union, the whole borderless, unlimited, unrestricted trade thing plays into this?
You're talking about NAFTA.
We're talking about NAFTA, and also the
Yep.
proposal to literally dissolve the borders from the North Pole all the way down to Central America.
That is correct. So President Trump is not in favor of this. He's said that NAFTA is one of the worst deals. Even it's the Iranian deal is the first, but the NAFTA deal, and he did cancel the Asian deal. And so, he wants to put together new deals with individual countries, and so that we deal with Canada first, we deal with Mexico, we deal with all the Central and South American countries individually, and not collectively, and where it gets out of control. And so you'll see a big difference in U.S. trade agreements, tariffs, manufacturing. You look at the report that just came out yesterday that from ADP, that manufacturing jobs are booming in the U.S. And so they reported that over 100,000 more jobs than predicted were created in February just due to President Trump's talking about new policies. They haven't even been implemented yet, but they've been talking about them. And so you're going to see a lot of manufacturing come back to the U.S. Samsung said they're going to come into the U.S. A lot of companies have said that, and so you're going to see a big change.
Well, that's terrific, and I do know that that's the case because I watch the business reports very closely, and between the stock market and the business reports, there were a lot of people prior to the election that thought, under a Hillary Clinton presidency, that we were going to literally drive the last nail in the coffin, and that the economic collapse was almost unavoidable. And as soon as Trump was elected, that mentality started to change. And right now, I think there's an optimism in our country that we may just dodge this bullet.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with that 100%. And you're going to see other countries. I mean, Japan and many other countries have already come back and said, hey, we're going to build more, we're going to do more infrastructure, we're going to have more money coming into the U.S. for jobs.
Yeah, it creates a very positive effect for Americans to think of America first again. That was a problem for, I would say, for several, maybe a couple decades. The American first idea was not in place, and we weren't taking into consideration the ill effects it had on our economy, and it gradually wore away to the very bone. And when President Trump said, make America first, he was talking about manufacturing, about keeping jobs here, and about creating a larger economy and a growth rate far better than the 1.5%, 2% that the current that the former administration was using. And since we all have business backgrounds, we understood that this is a formative way to really bring America back to the culture we had, to the work ethic we had, to make our country proud of itself again, not to consider ourselves second citizens. Those are very important ways that President Trump was conveying his message, and he delivered on them, and you can see it. Like Chuck and you were saying, there were 300,000 jobs created. We haven't seen that in a long time, and that's just in February. So we're looking at a larger impact across the board in economies of scale, and what people are thinking about America, how Americans are thinking about each other and treating each other with more respect, and having Americans come back together to fulfill our American dreams. The American dreams are shattered in the inner cities. They're shattered on the border areas here. They're shattered in all these other areas where you're looking at in the rural areas where they had bustling economies, in the steel areas in Pennsylvania. Those are all gone. They're dried up. I grew up in the Chicago area, and those steel mills are gone in the 80s and the 90s, and it's just horrific. And then you see the crime, and that's what President Trump was talking about. We're going to create a country that respects each other, and we're going to stop the crime, take care of all American citizens. And that's the idea of economic growth. It's about economic recovery. It's about economic freedom, working, helping each other, pull each other up by the strings. That's what it's about.
Dan, just here in the Northern Virginia, D.C. area, the MS-13 gang is killing people left and right. They're finding bodies in the parks and running areas all the time. And so, the criminals are taking over. And so by securing the border, it's going to have a ripple effect throughout the United States to make sure that all our citizens are protected and they have a much better life.
I think that was a really good point, and I was going to bring that up, and I'd like you to kind of elaborate on that. But the gangs and the criminal elements that are coming into our country across the border, I don't think average Americans realize just exactly how big an influence and how many there are. You have some pretty good ideas of some of the statistics on that. Can you maybe tell our listeners about some of the impacts that you know of?
all across the nation, the police departments have been stretched thin. You look at Baltimore. You look at Chicago, where Bruce is. You know, they've had over 100 murders so far just in 2017 due to gang violence and primarily due to drugs and territory. There are people that will just walk down the street because you don't have the right tattoo, you get shot. And so a lot of these gangs, especially MS-13 and others in this area and many other areas throughout the United States, in order to be associated and accepted into their gang, you've got to go out and commit a crime. You've got to go out and hurt somebody. You've got to go out and kill somebody. So, you know, these gangs are vicious. And again, I have been saying this for a long time. Our southern border is more violent than the Iraq border, the Afghan border, and many other borders throughout the world. And so we have to come to the reality of that. The federal government has to make sure that the federal government, the state, the cities, and the locales all work together on the police efforts. And that's why you got to get rid of these sanctuary politicians, these sanctuary cities, so that we have a system of police and enforcement that works.
Okay, Bruce, I know you've had a lot of concerns about the gangs as well. Can you maybe tell us what you think about the efforts that the police departments are working on and working with the federal government?
Well, we have to look at what Jeff Sessions had said. They're going to change it back to law and order, and that's the major component in stopping crime on the streets. Once you handcuff the policeman, you're not being able to enforce the laws, and that gives the gang members a big advantage on the streets. Say you have a task force that goes someplace and lays down the law, but they come in a secure area, say in the Chicago Englewood area or Austin area for 2 weeks. Once you leave, that 2-week period is up, you just come back in and do the same things they're normally doing. So what Chuck is saying and you are saying, how do you stop it at the root level, not just temporarily? And that has to be done at the border, and that has to be done in the cities, and allowing the police to do their job. And that's law and order. You know, we're looking at a different phase of understanding, social justice versus law and order. And that has a big determination on how the police are going to be treated by other people and how the police are going to be able to act on the streets to carry out the enforcement of what they're supposed to do. It's the same thing on the border. It's enforcement in the cities of Chicago, in New York. Rudy Giuliani could tell you about this upside down and backwards. It's about enforcement in L.A., enforcement over in San Diego, enforcement in Miami. You got the drugs, you got the gangs, you got the, other criminal activities going on. But it's about enforcement. It's about rule of law and allow the police to do their job and be respected doing it.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, one other thing that I'd like to add to this conversation is that when judges sentence these individuals to jail and then they get out of jail, they're supposed to call ICE, and ICE is supposed to come in and pick them up with a detainer and whatever. And you just recently had a judge in Washington State who had an illegal immigrant in her court who had been convicted, and so he came back and he was going to be released, and ICE agents were in the lobby ready to nab him, and this particular judge, she let him out through her judge's quarters back entrance so ICE could not get him. Eventually they got him within 2 or 3 days. But these are the kind of people that the American citizens don't want on the bench. They don't want as their politicians because they will allow these illegal immigrants to skate by, not be subject to our laws, but they want to enforce our laws against us and not them.
Well, that's a critical point, is that between our legal system and our elected officials, when they are allowed to circumvent or just totally ignore the law and do whatever they want, and it's totally unconstitutional and, quite frankly, in some ways treasonous, they need to be held accountable for that, and we need to start enforcing that. And I think if they did, then a lot of these judges and these so-called political leaders would have a different attitude.
Let me just add one more thing. The Boston Globe reported between 2008 and 2014, 13,000 criminal aliens were released back into the United States. That's because their own countries wouldn't take them back. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? And I remember when the Cuban boat thing happened back in, I don't remember, I guess it was the late 80s. Anyway, when Castro was emptying all of his prisons and putting them on boats and sending them to the U.S.,
That's right.
And we were accepting them, and they were some of the worst criminals. I mean, there might have been some, some political prisoners in that group too, and that would be fine. But there was no vetting, and they were being released into our culture, and some of them were really bad people.
Yes, and they also were spies too. I mean, he was sending spies in so they can carry out their activities and subterfuge, in various parts of the country to create unrest. So that's the part that I work on. When you have a lot of illegals coming through, they're also coming through as spies, or they're coming through as groups who are going to create social unrest, and that's not even taken into account. And that's what President Trump was also talking about. We're talking about ISIS and those areas, about terrorist activities too. That takes into account those areas that you have to directly address, because people don't know what's going on in the country if these people come through and they're not identified. There's not proper vetting on them. And that's what you're talking about, proper vetting, proper research, proper background. And Chuck, you want to weigh in on the E-Verify, because that's an area we didn't talk about?
Well, we've talked about it today, that employers have to be mandated by Congress to use E-Verify. E-Verify will check individual Social Security numbers to make sure that they are legally in the U.S. Now, one of the areas that we have to combat is that Mexico has 62 consular affairs offices all over the U.S., and they would give out what they call consular cards to illegal immigrants that will show their name, etc., who they are. And a lot of these sanctuary cities want to, they want to use these as proper documentation, which it isn't. And so, we need to make sure that E-Verify is legislated as mandatory, and then there are punishments of employers. One of the areas that, I went to a meeting several years ago at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and that is the only time I've ever seen the ACLU and the Chamber of Commerce and illegal immigration groups agree on the same thing. Again, the illegal immigration, ACLU, they want new voters. The Chamber of Commerce, they want cheap labor. And so, so they've been giving and taking for the last, 50 years or so on this issue, and it's by the time that that stopped. We don't need any illegal voters, and we don't need the extra cheap labor so that our U.S. citizens can have a job. And again, a lot of these progressives, they want $15 an hour. Well, a lot of these illegals are making $5, $6 to $10 an hour, and so they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth.
What I was also trying to get at here, also in relationship, was the visa overstays. Once we know who these people are, say, and they're staying over the visa, we want to know what they're doing, how they're doing it, and where they're going. In any other country, if you overstay your visa, you pay a penalty every day. I'm talking about if you go to an Asian country or a South American country, you have to pay extra stay there if you overextend your visa. Over here, we're not even doing anything anywhere close. And I think the E-Verify, you have an identification process where you know where people are, and then if they're criminals or people are aiding and abetting criminals, then you have a better way to address that issue for law and order purposes.
On the visa, there's a whole biometric legislation that Congress said that they wanted to do, but they haven't enforced it. And so every person that enters the U.S. through any airport, seaport, any kind of way legally should have biometrics, and then we need to be able to track them. We know where they go, if they're in college, or if they have a job, or who their employer is, or where their family is. So we got to track them down and find them and get them out of the country. I mean, there are millions of visa overstays. I've seen them here in the Washington, D.C. area where they go, yeah, I came from Somalia, I'm here, and I just stayed. Nobody's doing anything to me.
Yeah, and I think the numbers that you're talking, I know, the estimates that they've said of illegal aliens in the country, they say it's somewhere around 10 million. I think if realistically, and maybe you can enlighten the listeners on this, but I think realistically the numbers are at least double that and quite probably triple that.
Yeah, back in 2004, I was doing a lot of radio shows and working with the Bush administration on illegal immigration and comprehensive plans and whatever. Back then, in 2004, they were saying 20 million, and I'm sure it's 20 to 30 million today. And again, the politicians and everybody's lying about it because they don't want the American people to realize how big this number is. But it is a big number. It's more than 11. It's north of 20 million.
Yep, and it's a big cost. That's the thing. They don't want to talk about the cost to society, the cost to us, to the senior citizens, to the kids. There's a big cost involved, and that's where my concern comes about. Because as you get older, or if you have a problem with your insurance rates go up because of all the people using the emergency rooms across the country. They have to be, taken care of, and then those costs are shed onto us. They're put right back to us because we have to pay for the insurance. We have to pay for their care. That's what I'm talking about. There's a larger economic cost that goes on that's unseen in the underground economy, in the informal sector, where all this stuff is taking place. And that has to be talked about, and that's not being talked about fully at all. They don't want to address that issue.
Under Obama, one of the last reports that he had was that 45 plus million Americans are out of work. Well, if you have 20 plus million illegals here, if you get rid of them, guess what? You got 20 million Americans who are going to go back to work.
Right. Well, and I know they say, well, a lot of these jobs are menial labor, and nobody will take those jobs. But I know for a fact, I'm a commercial building contractor by background, and the building fields are absolutely filled with illegal, or not necessarily illegal, but the building trades are filled with people from Mexico and Latin America, because they come in and they learn these skilled trades and they take jobs away from other Americans.
Yep. Yeah. We need to get back to the trade associations, the training, the Future Farmers of America and all those other sorts of training in high schools and tech, colleges and institutions. There is a huge gap right now in all of the service industries and construction and welding. All those areas, there is a huge minus of American citizens because, a lot of the progressives want all the kids to go to college and get a master's degree in basket weaving or, whatever, history or this or that or whatever, and they have no skills. They got to go where the skills are and where the jobs are.
Yeah, there needs to be a understanding of the blue-collar class and what that takes, and that's where Trump was getting a lot of his support, because the work ethic of the American people still exists. And if you're in a more urban area, and that's what Chuck is saying, they're saying, well, we don't go out fishing anymore. We just go out to eat, and we go get our lattes. It's a whole different psychological framework than if you're out working the ground, you're out, working a job, doing a construction site. And President Trump was saying, we'll get you back to work. We're going to start the infrastructure projects back up. We're going to get America great again. We're going to make America proud again. We're going to improve our airports. That's what it's all about, and that's the working class Americans. Those are the people who go out and work those jobs.
Well, you're right, and the comment or the phrase low-skilled workers in reference to the construction trades and other things like that, that is absolutely false. I mean, at the point we're at right now in our nation's history, the trades are actually better paid in many ways than college graduates that are doing more menial type tasks, and the trades are really an important area. And a lot of the trades right now, those jobs are being filled by people that may not be here legally.
Well, I mean, think about becoming an electrician. You go through apprenticeship and journeyman, and then you become a boss, and then you take on other contracting positions. You become an independent contractor. There's a lot of benefits of learning it through a whole system, like DeVry, or a system where you get electronics background or heating and air conditioning. Those are always going to be needed in this country. And if you're trying to teach people about the work ethic and what needs to be done, those are the areas that are going to always be in place for people to get jobs. And that's the same thing you're saying in your construction area. I look at it, I grew up in a steel mill area, and I worked in the steel mills on a Ford assembly line, and we did what we needed to do to make a buck, but we also needed to know that, we respected those jobs, and those jobs were valuable for the country. And, you see smoke coming out of the smokestacks, people are eating, kids are going to school, you're going to grow up and get an education. That's what happens. And people are not realizing that very basic economic function, that basic work ethic is the key to the factor of all this, and that's what President Trump is all about.
Well, that's we're at the very end of the show now, and I kind of wanted to give both of you gentlemen an opportunity to talk about how average Americans can make a difference in closing the illegal immigration issue and supporting President Trump. So I guess, Bruce, I'll start with you, and then we'll lead on to Chuck.
Okay. Write, email, telephone the heads of the Senate and the House and your local congressman, and express to them your point. Have your friends and neighbors do that. Also express to them what you've experienced in terms of crime, you experienced at the border, and that'll give them the ability to understand better about the people of America, how it's impacting them. We have to talk about the impact, not about what the news is saying is going on, but what's impacting you in your daily lives. And that's most important. Tell them what's going on. Let them know what's happening in your daily life, and that will ring the bell.
Okay, Chuck?
Yep. So what you have to do is, again, what Bruce said, you got to put pressure on everybody from President Trump on down. You got to go to your local meetings, your school board meetings, your county council meetings. You have to write articles in newspapers. You have to be proactive. Start groups with, Facebook and all kinds of other things in order to get the word out. You have to be proactive. This is an issue that cannot die. It has to be front and center. And the progressives with George Soros, they're going to be throwing millions and millions of dollars at this. And so we cannot be weak-kneed, cannot have any weak backbones. We have to be vigilant, and we have to be very proactive and demand that that border be closed.
Well, as always, you gentlemen provide a terrific insight into the national security issues and a very interesting program. And I know that even though this was part two, bottom line is probably we need to have you gentlemen back at another time, maybe later this year, and we'll find out how the progress is moving on the border security issue. So with that, I would like to thank our listeners for joining us again this week for another segment in our Connecting the Dots series, and ask our listeners to please come back next week and join us for another program on another issue so that we may help you to connect the dots. Thank you, and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.